All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. You are linked into the virtual town hall hosted by Reform California. And our topic today is quite timely because the governor will be releasing a budget this week. The topic is how COVID-19 and excessive spending may create a wave of bankruptcies in California state and local government. There is no doubt that we face the most severe fiscal crisis in California that we have in our entire history. And this fiscal crisis will shake state government and local government to their core in different ways. But make no mistake about it, the fiscal crisis was not caused by COVID-19. COVID-19 basically has hastened the path of fiscal collapse of the state of California, but it really is man-made. State politicians, local politicians are responsible for putting the state and local governments in a position where even a small recession would create a massive fiscal collapse. On today's town hall, we're going to be joined by State Senator John Moorlach, Will Swaim of the California Policy Center, and Brian Pepin of not only the San Diego Lincoln Club, but the City of Poway Budget Review Committee. I'm Carl DeMaio, Chairman of Reform California. As I mentioned, you can ask questions by raising your hand on the Zoom app. We will put you in queue and call on you at the end. If you're on a phone, just hit *9 and we'll call on you at the end. And if your questions are not answered, you can always email info@reformcalifornia.org at the end of the program. For those of you who are not familiar with Reform California, we are a 527 political action committee founded in 2004. We've defeated over $3 billion in tax hikes since then. We do exposés on government waste, fraud, and abuse. We did sponsor the recall of State Senator Josh Newman for his decision to vote for the car tax and the gas tax, and we successfully removed him from office. And we sponsored and qualified the gas tax repeal in 2018, Prop 6, which was defeated not because of lack of voter support for repealing the gas tax. It was defeated because state politicians changed the title on the ballot to confuse voters. Reform California is funded not by business entities or labor unions. We are funded entirely by grassroots supporters, and we are not afraid to fight. In California, we need more fighters to speak truth to power. You're going to hear from some of those fighters today with Moorlach, Senator John Moorlach, Will Swaim, Brian Pepin, and others. Here is basically the headline, the simple summary of what you're going to learn. California state local government is facing its worst financial crisis ever. The blame is not COVID-19. And what you can expect in the coming weeks and months are politicians calling for bailouts and tax hikes. We should be resoundingly rejecting bailouts and tax hikes in favor of reform. Even before COVID-19, California was a dumpster fire, a complete mess, driven by an extreme progressive base and labor union bosses. California politicians have created the perfect storm. Toxic job-killing policies like AB 5. That's just the latest nasty job killer bill that's been implemented to ban independent contractors in California and fine small businesses. High government salaries and bloated bureaucracies, unsustainable pensions and retiree healthcare systems, exceptionally generous welfare programs, and the latest is a complete and utter dysfunctional approach to dealing with homelessness, where we throw more and more money at a problem and enable the individuals to remain in homelessness rather than dealing with their root causes of dependency. All of these pre-existing conditions, if you will, since we're all talking from a healthcare standpoint, all of these pre-existing conditions in California will result in California's recovery taking far longer than other states because of our poor starting point. And this is important to look at because you'll see other states reopening. You'll see other states dealing with a financial problem of reduced revenues, of slower economic growth, of more unemployment insurance claims. they will have a challenge in other states to deal with the fallout of COVID-19, but they'll be far better positioned to survive than California. So California's problems and the severity of our problems are really of our own doing. The politicians created this environment. COVID-19 was just the icing on the cake, the tipping point. So I want to give you graphically what's really going on here to understand the fiscal crisis. It's not just that COVID-19 will cause an increase in spending. It's that COVID-19, while causing an increase in spending, will simultaneously result in a dramatic drop in revenue. And even if we have the best case scenario where we reopen fully, by the way, by June 1st, which nobody sees that happening, our revenue will only slightly increase as we slowly recover. That's best case scenario. We're not going to see a best case scenario. It's going to be far worse than even this graph depicts. So let's talk about spending. How will spending spike with COVID-19? Well, obviously, an increase in public health and medical expenses as people need medical care because of the disease. A massive increase in unemployment claims and social service and welfare claims. 4.5 million Californians, for example, have filed for unemployment since March 12th. Last week alone, $3.4 billion in unemployment checks were distributed. The state is literally out of unemployment funds and has had to borrow against the federal government. Eventually, those funds will have to be repaid. And now, at the same time, we're going to have massive increased outlays for homeless programs as we rent hotel rooms. The governor, instead of dealing with the root cause of homelessness, has decided, well, we're just going to coddle them. In San Francisco, they're actually giving drugs and alcohol to homeless individuals at hotels. Pay hikes are being called for across the state. Most recently, they disguised the pay hikes as, quote, hazard pay for essential employees. And of course, a lot of overtime. Bailout programs. One was just announced today for renters, but there are a number of programs that have been put in place across the state to give free money. And then, of course, pension costs will go up, and that'll be a delayed expenditure because the investment losses in pension systems will not fully materialize until the following year. Those lavish pensions really are going to be one of the biggest drivers of our financial challenge. The starting point is that we have $500 billion to $1 trillion in unfunded liabilities before COVID-19. And that was already putting the state and local governments on the path to bankruptcy. These state and local pension systems still have unrealistic investment returns, and with COVID-19 devastating the stock market and businesses across the country and across the globe, there is no safe haven for pension systems to try to beat the market. They will see market losses, investment losses, at the same time that they're assuming rosy scenarios. Of course, you'll see pension spiking scams continue during this period, and the hazard pay proposals. Most people don't know, but hazard pay is pensionable pay, and that will be part of spiking pensions for state and local government employees, as they say, well, we deserve hazard pay. That hazard pay will be included in their pension calculations, and that was not planned on in the actuarial models up to this point. And the economic crisis is where you're going to see a dramatic drop in revenues. There's now projected 18 to 22% unemployment for California, and that's compared to 12.3% during the Depression in the 1930s. And you take a look at the delta there. That is just the beginning. You're going to see a number of revenue categories drop, starting first with hotel taxes, which is mainly a local revenue source, not a state level revenue source. But hotel taxes have gone down about 95% statewide in April, closer to 100% in some jurisdictions. And that hotel tax for cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego is a core portion of their budget, gone in 1 month. Income tax for the state of California is plummeting. You see the state of California disproportionately relying on high income earners and capital gains taxes, well, those will take a major sucker punch as investment returns and the capital markets take a dive. Sales tax has plummeted, and that, of course, is both a state and local revenue source. Unemployment insurance, as less people are working, less people are paying into unemployment. Fees and permits will drop. That's both a state and local impact. Even something as simple as parking meters, as people are no longer going parking for events or parking for shopping, that will plummet. Rents for stadiums, revenue share agreements, profit shares down dramatically. Business taxes will drop as businesses decide to shutter rather than try to reopen. Property transfer tax will also go down as not as many homes will be put up for sale. And I put property tax last, and that's, people may be surprised by that. Property tax revenues, because of Prop 13, and Prop 13 is a very good stabilizer for property tax revenues. Property tax revenues will likely not start being reduced until we enter a more severe recession, because property values thus far seem to be unaffected. Now, the longer this drags on, the more likelihood that you're going to have an impact on property tax. But take a look. There's not one category of revenue for state and local government that has been unaffected by this. Although some would argue fines and penalties for business owners that reopen prematurely may be the only revenue source that goes up for state and local government. Here are some of the deficits projected at the state level. The governor is projecting a $54 billion estimate shortfall. The LAO, Legislative Analyst Office, has said that they see annual deficits until 2023-24 of 20 to 30 billion. I believe both sets of numbers are understated because we see two factors that will add on to the assumptions made in the governor's forecast and the LAO forecast, and that is a post-COVID-19 recession. Both the governor and the LAO are assuming that COVID-19 will be a one-time disruption, a very heavy disruption that will take time to overcome. I think the evidence is clear as the governor drags his feet on reopening, and as you see tweets by Lorena Gonzalez basically celebrating the loss of businesses in California, combined with the already toxic environment of policies like AB5 and PAGA and other bad policies and high taxes, that we are likely going to see a much more severe post-COVID-19 recession, which will in turn impact things like property values and property tax revenues. And of course, we do have the most lavish pension benefits in the country in California. And I believe that pension crisis and increased pension annual required contributions will hit next year rather than this year in terms of hitting state budgets. So we think that the governor's estimate is on the low end of assumptions for shortfall. At the local level, you have counties, cities, special districts, and schools. And we just want to look at two categories where we can actually do a more precise job evaluating the financial impact. City governments, according to the League of Cities, are going to have a $7 billion shortfall in the next 2 years. But the California League of Cities is only assuming that the lockdown will extend to the end of May. Guys, that's not happening according to Gavin Newsom, who insists that we all remain locked down and that no one can go back to work. Think about this. Of that shortfall, 57% was attributed to sales tax revenues dropping, 27% attributed to hotel tax drops. We believe that a more realistic scenario with a longer term lockdown is $15 to $25 billion in the next 2 years for city governments. And again, that starts picking up some of the property tax reductions that you're likely to see with the post-COVID-19 recession, a real recession, along with lingering drops in sales and hotel taxes the longer we keep lockdowns in place. At the school level, school districts and community colleges used to rely on a stable revenue source with Prop 98, guaranteeing a share of the general fund. But when the general fund revenues drop, so do required funds for schools. Likely impact is $20 to $25 billion, a $2,000 to $2,800 per student hit. Now, the governor seems to be predicting $1,400 to $1,700 per student hit. We believe it's going to be much higher, again, because schools also, in addition to receiving general fund revenues, also have local property taxes that they are able to gain share from. We believe that those deficits will be higher. In addition, you're going to have higher expenses for basically making schools COVID-19 ready. A big increase in expenses. Are we going to be able to get children to school in buses? Who knows? Transit may be dead. And so you look at all the increased costs as well as reduced revenues, and schools are likely to have a pretty substantial hit. Look at the headline today. Again, the reason why I use that photo is it reflects the zealotry on the left of, in a crisis, in a budget deficit, do nothing more than raise taxes, shut businesses down, and increase spending. Today's LA Times is celebrating a proposal by Senate Democrats in Sacramento to provide rent relief for tenants. Basically, tenants would be given taxpayer loans for free. And they would have to repay them over a period of 5 to 10 years. Yeah, there's no money. So we're going to be giving more welfare programs out. And then they decide, well, maybe we can offer businesses a deal. We'll let them prepay taxes that they would owe ordinarily over the next 5 to 10 years in exchange for a slight reduction in those taxes. Here's a memo to state politicians. Nobody believes that you will refrain from raising taxes. So why give you a prepayment on taxes in exchange for a reduction? You don't really think we're that dumb, do you? Actually, they do, because they realize they keep getting reelected. And so at a time when we have massive deficits being predicted, we are seeing proposals like this introduced in Sacramento. Let's talk about bankruptcy. There are really 3 drivers of bankruptcy. And Senator Mitch McConnell raised the prospect of bankruptcy about 2 weeks ago, only to be shunned by it. Right now, states are not eligible for bankruptcy protection, but local governments are. And we've seen a couple of high-profile bankruptcies in California: Stockton, Vallejo, San Bernardino. Bankruptcy would be driven by, number one, inability to pay bills, and we call that a cash flow deficit. We are seeing this to be more likely and more common a problem as these local governments have labor contracts, fixed costs. They have basic core responsibilities like public safety that their revenues may not be able to sustain. We also see a risk for violating reserve requirements for various instruments of debt and bonds as they dip into reserves to try to delay the inevitable. And of course, the big driver, spikes in annual required contributions for government pensions. You're going to see that this year, but a lot more hitting next year. The bankruptcy process is actually quite simple. You just simply establish that an entity is insolvent, and we believe there are a number of entities around the state of California that meet that definition. We also would require, under bankruptcy, a reform plan be developed. Now, the brilliant part of bankruptcy for a city or county is that you get to reopen your labor contract, and you can renegotiate salaries, benefits, and work rules for all existing employees. You can also reopen other contracts. And the reason why I give an example here is of stadium deals. San Diego had a ticket guarantee at one point for the Chargers, but 10 years ago. That could have been eliminated in a bankruptcy process because every contract and obligation and liability is put on the table, including obligations to creditors such as bondholders. And yes, there is now case law that has been established that judges have ruled that vested pension benefits are subject to bankruptcy reorganization. Well, all of this would be put into a plan by the local governing body, a city council, a county board, a school board. That reform plan would then be presented to a federal judge, not a state judge, not one of Gavin Newsom's handpicked judges, but a federal judge for review and for approval. And then, of course, a plan would be implemented. The reason why I put the deadline clock up there is that you got to start moving pretty quick on looking at your bankruptcy options if you don't get concessions from your labor unions up front. If you can't balance your budget as a city, county, or school board, you're going to have to look at bankruptcy, because it does take time to go through this process. Likely responses from our liberal politicians at the state and local level: more spending. We're seeing that across the board. They're addicts. They simply cannot contain giving out more and more and more. Of course, they're going to be talking about bailouts, that they expect the federal government to come in. Yesterday, Gavin Newsom said they wanted $1 trillion. Those bailouts need to be opposed because COVID-19 was not the root cause. They will talk about tax and fee hikes. They're going to obviously be moving forward on the repeal of Prop 13, the split roll initiative. They might also include additional tax and fee increases in the state's budget. And of course, they'll talk about, quote, temporary sales tax measures at the local level. One thing to note, California League of Cities had a presentation 2 weeks ago, and they thought only city officials were on a phone call, but we had others on there. And they basically spent most of their time talking about various ways that cities and counties could raise taxes. That's the California League of Cities. That's their solution. And then finally, bonds. They're going to look to issue bonds to cover their deficits. One of the biggest instruments to cover a general fund deficit would be a pension obligation bond. Look out for those sorts of borrowing schemes in the next few weeks and months. The best way to defeat them is to show the public the wasteful spending. Why should we borrow? Why should we get a bailout in California when we're giving $1,000 payout to illegal immigrants, when we're giving free healthcare to illegal immigrants, when we have a legal defense fund for illegal immigrants to sue the federal government through legal services provided to people here illegally, when we have a high-speed rail project that voters have rejected, when we have gold-plated pensions or gold-plated salaries. The list goes on and on and on. If we get into a situation where we're arguing about whether we should or should not have police coverage, we're going to lose the debate. We should be pointing out how many in the city government are earning $100,000 or more per year, and how many people are retiring at $100,000 or more per year. That forces change. That forces the focus back to where the problem is, which is uncontrolled spending. So advice for reformers: number one, get fiscal facts. All of the local governments have until June 30th to adopt their budget. The state also has a similar timeline. So in the next few weeks, state officials and local officials will be evaluating their revenues for next year, and they will be adopting budgets. The fiscal facts are going to be hidden. They're not going to be honest about how big of a hit. And some of them are just in denial. They're not just lying to you, they're lying to themselves. They're trying to say, oh, no, everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to recover. The revenue hits won't be that great. So if you are in a community, I would urge you to attend the budget hearings at your city, county, school board. Pay attention to their revenue assumptions. Ask tough questions. If you're in the media, ask tough questions. Take a look at projections. Truth test them. Take a look at different scenarios. What might happen if it's a more aggressive drop in revenue? Ask them why they're not curtailing spending and having a rainy day fund in case the COVID-19 challenges get worse. The first and most important thing we must insist on are real numbers in the budgeting process. Second, demand immediate spending cuts. And that's where local government has the ability to reopen labor contracts. Now, the union bosses aren't going to want to reopen labor contracts. They're going to say, to hell with the taxpayer, raise taxes. But there are provisions in place to reopen labor contracts in times of emergency. And these are suggestions that you ought to advance. You're going to be told, no, legally it can't be done. The answer is yes, you can. Take a look at the contracts one by one and raise the issue of bankruptcy. If they don't allow us to reopen these contracts through normal order, bankruptcy already allows us to reopen the contracts and allows us to go after the pension benefits. So pick your poison, guys. You want to help us get through this through reductions that are common sense, or do you want to dig your heels in and try to put a gun to the head of the taxpayers. That's where we're headed right now, is an inability and unwillingness to make the spending cuts. And finally, the third step is obviously when they do reject spending cuts, their only other option is to put a bond and a tax hike on the ballot. Let them know that there will be aggressive funded opposition to their tax hikes. And this is where Reform California is already building statewide infrastructure, borrowing from the infrastructure we built with the gas tax repeal to help local reformers prepare to defeat bond and tax hike measures in November. With that, I see Senator John Moorlach has joined us. Senator Moorlach is a CPA in Sacramento, which makes him a very rare breed. He's also a reformer, and he has experience in Orange County when they went through their bankruptcy. He was actually the guy who called it out right from the beginning that Orange County was headed for a fiscal collapse, and was part of the effort to restore Orange County to fiscal sanity. Senator Moorlach, what are you seeing in the outlook for the state and local finances in California?
Well, Carl, you've kind of covered it pretty well. The train wreck that you and I had anticipated for many years has been accelerated, and it's hitting the wall as we speak. So it's going to be a rather interesting budget cycle here up in Sacramento, dealing with the Budget and Fiscal Review Committee in the Senate. I anticipate being added to the Budget Conference Committee, so I'll be pretty busy up until June 15. And as you've already pointed out, they've provided some interesting ideas with a press conference this morning, just an hour before you started. So it's going to be an interesting
What are you suggesting at the state level be done?
Well, when you get into a fiscal crisis, and you pointed out most of them, but there are about 4 or 5 areas that you look at. The first is what revenues can you raise? So you've already pointed that out, that they'll be asking for tax increases. What expenses can you cut? What assets can you sell? What debts can you refinance at a lower rate? And in Orange County, what we did is, number 5, who can you sue for bringing you to the dance? So we had to sue the investment firms that helped our former treasurer invest in a rather unwise investment scheme. But I don't know who you would sue other than the country of China, and good luck with that. Can you hear me okay, Carl?
No, we certainly can. I think my internet was bad for a bit. What other additional efforts do you think that we should be undertaking? Because we have mainly fiscal reformers from across the state on this Zoom. We have about 800 people logged in right now. Additional ideas you have and recommendations for how they can push for reform and push back against borrowing, excessive spending, and tax hikes in the coming weeks?
Well, Carl, you know that this legislature will not ever consider pension reform as legislation. 2, you've tried a ballot measure. You know how long it takes, and you know what the Attorney General is going to do to your ballot title. So 3, you look at Chapter 9, and you tell your employee unions, we are going to go into Chapter 9 where we control the plan of adjustment, where we control the reforms that are going to be implemented, working with the creditors. And so there are 3 things that they should do. One is you need to reform the pension plan. There is a model that has been working quite well for almost 40 years in the state of Wisconsin. It's called shared risk. It's a defined benefit pension plan, but it's done properly. It has reasonable investment assumptions, like maybe 4% a year in earnings instead of 7%. It has reasonable retirement ages, like 65 in the private sector. It doesn't provide for cost of living adjustments for retirees unless the pension outperforms its anticipated returns. It requires higher contributions by employees should the returns be below what they were anticipating. It's a shared risk plan. You know, Carl, that the unions are not going to accept a defined contribution plan. They have fought us for the last 20 years on that front. So if you give them a little hybrid that says, okay, look, moving forward, this is how we structure it. Every time you look at the Pew report on all 50 states, Wisconsin is always number 1. and it's always fully funded. Why? Because it's a defined benefit pension plan that is based on the right metrics. The second thing is you have to look at the retiree medical, which is the other big, massive unfunded liability that cities, states, or counties, school districts are facing. The city of Stockton, in their Chapter 9 bankruptcy just a few years ago, almost completely eliminated their retiree medical, and that removed $500 million from their balance sheet. So that made for an amazing change in their financial plan going forward. And the third thing you have to look at is, what about these unused vacation and sick leave plans? Why does a person, when he retires or she, take the hours and then multiply that by the final salary per hour and then walk out with massive paychecks when they leave the building? I've seen workers at the County of Orange leave with more than $300,000 just because they didn't take their vacations when they were younger, and they let those hours just stay there, and then they get this massive check. If those plans haven't already been modified and adjusted by the municipalities, that's an area, another ripe area for fixing things. So this is a real opportunity for leadership. The issue now is there a will? Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry. What can we do to affect change in the legislature, or is it pretty much a lost cause until we can put new people into office come November?
Well, I've learned the hard way that pension reform is almost a non-starter. I've introduced a number of bills. I even did an interesting bill a few years ago. Governor Brown and Janet Napolitano from the California University of California system. Jerry Brown said to Ms. Napolitano, "I'll give the system more money, but you got to provide a defined contribution plan for new hires. New employees should be able to select whether they want to be in the defined benefit plan or the 401k." And at this point, almost 37% of new employees for the UC system have chosen the defined contribution plan. They actually prefer it. The Democrats here hate it. The last 2 years, the Assembly Budget Committee has tried to kill that plan during our budget conference meetings. Fortunately, they haven't. But Senator Stephen Glazer out of the Bay Area did a bill a few years ago to allow all state employees to adopt a 401k plan. And I was the co-author. And when it went to the first committee, Public Employee and Retirement Committee in the Senate, it only got one vote. That was mine. A Republican abstained and the 3 Democrats voted no, and it didn't go anywhere. Now, Stephen Glazer is a good man and he's concerned about the finances of this state. But what happened to him for doing this bill? One, he couldn't even get an endorsement from the Democrat Party when they met in Long Beach in the fall. And the unions are not endorsing him because he dared to do some pension reform. So you're not going to see it out of the majority party. The monopoly party. And so I don't see any reform coming out of this legislature. That's why it's got to be done through a Chapter 9 bankruptcy setting.
Appreciate you and all your leadership, Senator Morlock. And we know you're in a tough race in November, and we're going to be there 110% behind you because we need fiscally responsible voices in Sacramento, and you've been a great voice up there.
Thank you, Carl.
So next up, we've got Will Swaim from California Policy Center. California Policy Center can help you, all right? They are there to give you research support, and they run an organization called the California Local Elected Officials. Basically, CLEO brings together local elected officials to share practices and access California Policy Center resources. Will, thanks for stopping by. What do you see as the path forward in California to prevent the fiscal collapse of the state and local governments?
Well, it is impossible to follow up with new information when I follow you guys. We're looking with a team that includes financial analysts from around the state. Carl, you are involved in this effort. We're looking at the path forward. And bottom line is, I don't think you get any reform done, as the senator just pointed out. You don't get any reform done unless you actually have a weapon. And the weapon here is federal bankruptcy protection under Chapter 9. So we have started a project here, as you guys both know, to really analyze local finances. And we've gone through the finances of over 300 cities in California and come up with a list of the 10 likeliest to be in financial trouble. And unfortunately, as you guys have pointed out, financial trouble is not enough to nudge the political class toward reform. Their inevitable response to financial trouble is simply raise taxes for everybody and then complete the cycle of taxing and ruining the economy and dropping revenues. So we're looking for those particular cases where financial difficulty meets with political leadership of the sort that is really ready to take on government unions. That's a unique class of individuals, of course, as you guys have said. Most politicians in California get elected with the assistance of public employee unions in California. That's why when the coming rash of tax hikes and new bonds are issued, you'll absolutely see police, firefighters, and teachers as the face of those tax hikes. And anybody who opposes these hikes or this new bond debt will be labeled as anti-teacher, anti-child, you hate cops, you hate firefighters. In reality, as you said, Carl, very early on, we have to come prepared to really talk about what the real issues are. And they are, as you guys have both laid out, really pretty simple. We've spent far more than we bring on, and we hide all the debt in the seat cushions, in the closets. We ask people not to look there. So if people go to California Policy Center right now, the CPC website, californiapolicycenter.org, the main story there is that list of the 10 worst cities. And Carl, I'd like to take a moment, if I could, to direct people's attention also to the CLEO website. You mentioned California local elected officials. Right at the very top of the homepage for CA local elected officials.org. That's CA, like the abbreviation for California, local elected officials.org. Right at the top of that page is a little button that you can push that tells you how to rate your city's finances. It's a little tutorial on YouTube from our friends at the public interest accounting firm, Taxpayers. Oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on the name. How embarrassing. Both of you guys will know these people. Anyway, it's a fun little tutorial. Pardon?
Truth in Accounting.
There you go. Thank you, John. Truth in Accounting. See, living in California, the words truth and accounting so rarely come together. But yeah, TIA has put together this wonderful tutorial that will show people like me who were liberal arts majors in college how to actually calculate your community's financial risk, its liabilities right now. It's a very simple little course in how to read publicly available public finance documents and figure out where your community stands. And if people need help, of course, Carl, they can reach out to our organization. We'll plug them in with financial analysts who can take a look at their community's public finances. But again, the bottom line is not whether your community is going insolvent. It's, do you have the political will in your community to lead a revolt against higher taxes that are inevitably coming,
I also want to point out a couple other resources that California Policy Center has. You will have government employees stand up there and say that they can't give anything back, that they are already underpaid, that they need salary increases. In the city of San Diego, they're asking for a $50 million salary increase right now, in the middle of the worst financial crisis we've had. If you go to transparentcalifornia.org, you can look up the salaries as well as the pensions for each entity of government. And that's all provided by California Policy Center. They support that website. So when you are at the city council, demand that your politicians explain why you have so many six-figure pensions and six-figure salaries. And maybe we should make some reductions in those categories to save jobs, to save services, to prevent tax increases, et cetera. And so if you need research, that's where you go, California Policy Center, and those websites are phenomenal tools for reformers at the local level. Thank you, Will. Now, we also have individuals that are engaging in their local government's budgeting process. We wanted to bring on Brian Pepin, who has two hats. He's with the Lincoln Club of San Diego, which is a business-friendly organization, as well as he serves as a volunteer commissioner of the Poway City Budget Review Committee. And he basically looks at the budget documents and figures out what's right, what's wrong. Brian, thanks for stopping by. Do you have any advice for reformers who want to do a similar role that you're playing in Poway?
Yeah, thank you, Carl and Will and Senator, and for all the panelists or all the attendees on today's call, you're the folks that care, that are dialed in, and you understand the crisis that's facing the state. And it's pretty clear in the next few months, many more Californians are going to start caring, because this budget crisis isn't just at the state level, it's at the county level, it's at the city level. And yeah, I've got some unique experience having worked at the city of San Diego, which is the 8th largest city in the country, 2nd largest city by population in the state of California. And now helping with the city of Poway's budget review committee. So I'm seeing it at every level. And you talk about the scale of it's city of Poway, which is a city of 50,000 people, a suburb of San Diego. We're talking about a $4.7 million budget deficit. That's a huge deal for a city that size. You look at the city of San Diego, $3.9 billion budget deficit. And like Carl said, the state of California is looking at a $54 billion budget deficit. I think there's late breaking news that the United States deficit is apparently $738 billion. I just got an alert on my phone a few minutes ago. So we're talking about unbelievable numbers. And when you talk about the local cities, it's going to have a huge impact on the lives of families and Californians in every corner of this state. People are soon going to realize when their services at their libraries or their street repavings or law enforcement, fire, those are the things that local governments provide. And all of these are going to be affected in the next few months. In the city of Poway specifically, we're so fortunate to have had a long history of great elected officials who have taken all the necessary steps that they could to limit the pension liabilities and make sure that they're keeping up on deferred maintenance and things like that. But what's scary is even a city like Poway, where we've got great leadership and solid finances, in the state of California, they're still under pressure constantly by a lot of state rules and requirements. For example, pension reform. A lot of individuals think that, why don't small cities just reform their pensions, go to a 401k plan, which makes a lot of sense and would be wonderful. But as some of our panelists know, in California, most cities are enrolled in CalPERS. And once you do that, it's almost impossible to get out. And so it's going to be really tough here over the next few months and the next few years for small cities that are on the front line of delivering those services to Californians. And so, and that's the overview from me. We all need to be dialed in. More than anything, for all of the attendees on today's call, let your local elected officials know you got their back, that you're there for them. They're under an immense amount of pressure from labor unions, from a lot of interest groups, and they need to know that the public is behind them, and that when they stick their neck out and make those reforms, that you're with them. So that's my overview, Carl.
Thanks so much. And Brian, how did you get in that position in the first place? Because I know there's a lot of activists and reformers that would love to be made a member of a budget review committee. How did you get that?
So go on your local city's website or your county. Every agency in this state has these boards and commissions, sometimes to a fault. I think the city of San Diego at one point had over 40 of these. Fortunately in Poway, as an example, we have a couple, one that reviews the budget, one that reviews the park and rec activities of the city. And so go on the city website, but I made a point to reach out to some of our local elected officials and let them know that was something I was interested in. So again, that's one of the best ways that any of the attendees on today's call can get involved, can get plugged in, and again support their local elected officials who would sometimes like to start reforming things, but aren't quite sure if they've got the support and backing that they need.
Well, you're right that there are many of these committees across the state of California, but not every school, not every county, not every city has a budget review committee. And so in your jurisdiction, if you don't have a budget review committee of citizens for your city or your county, you can propose one. And if you're an elected official, you can create one. And so it never hurts to have an extra set of eyes looking at the budget. Of course, the bureaucracy doesn't want that because they like the idea that no one's watching the budget too carefully. But this is one of the easiest things to propose in the next few weeks is go to your elected officials at the local level and say, why don't we convene a panel of 12, 13, 5, 6 business leaders, CPAs, fiscal experts to look at our budget and give us some thoughtful ideas. And so that might be one of the easiest ways to put an oar in the water for anyone interested in taking a larger role on fiscal reform locally. Brian, thanks. Now we'll talk about questions, but for next steps, what we're hoping you'll do is, number one, we are organizing a statewide campaign to oppose every tax hike, both local and statewide in California in November. And so the best way for us to do that is to send everyone to one website, and that's the website that's focused right now on defeating the initiative on the November ballot statewide that would basically gut Prop 13. It's called Split Roll. That website is stoppropertytaxhikes.com. We also use that name because a lot of these bonds are basically paid for by a special assessment property or parcel tax. Stoppropertytaxhikes.com. Now, when someone signs up on that website, not only will we activate them for the effort statewide to save Prop 13, but if there's a local tax measure that is considered in their jurisdiction, we will immediately let them know and activate them in their locality. So my view is, why build a campaign separately for every single tax hike in the state? Why not build one campaign and mobilize people for anything that's on their individual ballot raising taxes? So we need your help. Share the website, stoppropertytaxhikes.com. We also need you to become an activist. So if you're not already signed up on our network, go to reformcalifornia.org/volunteer. And when you go to that website, there's a number of different roles that you can sign up for. Again, you'll be given emails with different volunteer opportunities, and you can accept or reject them as you are able. And finally, we are grassroots funded, so please consider a contribution of any amount at reformcalifornia.org. With that, let's open it up to questions. On your Zoom app, all you have to do is click raise hand, and you can ask a question. You'll be put in a queue. On your phone, hit *9, and the same process will go into place. And then you can also email us any questions, info@reformcalifornia.org or carl@reformcalifornia.org. With that, let's go to our first questions while Dave gets the audio questions available. We've got a question from Bob Ayers. He says, what about defaults to bondholders with decreased revenues and taxes? John, would you like to take that one? Any concept of risk of default to bondholders in the future?
I think there is a risk to bondholders, but if the bankruptcy filing is structured properly, the city will do its best to maintain the bondholders in place. It was a pretty difficult thing for the city of Stockton to stiff the bondholders, but they were pension obligation bonds, which were high risk to begin with. Kind of an interesting space that maybe some people shouldn't be in, but that's another subject. But city's going to have to be real careful on how they treat bondholders, that they should not be the only ones to take the haircut. Right now, the largest creditor for cities are the employees when it comes to their pensions, their retiree medical, and to their accrued unpaid sick leave and vacations. And the taxpayers of the city aren't going to put up with that. They're not going to say, wait a second, we're not going to stiff everybody else, but not the employees. Something has to give. And this is an opportunity for unions to step up. We did it in Orange County. Back in 2006, we were able to negotiate with the largest employee bargaining units in Orange County government, representing almost the entire 18,000 employees, but not all of them. And we were able to get them to make massive reforms to the retiree medical. We took the unfunded liability from 1.4 billion down to 400 million. And we did that without having to go to bankruptcy court. But they came to us and said, we want raises. Well, you can't have retiree medical, a pension, and raises. So if we can work together, we reduce what's called the annual required contribution by $100 million a year. So between the $1 billion reduction in the liability and the 8 years I served as a supervisor, I basically, with that one move, returned the $1.7 billion loss we lost in the bankruptcy. So it can be done.
We got a question from Norm. We're going to activate him, his audio. Norm Root. Go ahead, Norm. Norm, we can't hear you. Do we have another one? Armin? Armand, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for taking my question. So about how much will, with this continued explosion in debt for the state, cost from a servicing perspective going forward? And can we show that, like, over the next 5 or 10 years, the cost of that debt service, especially as related to maybe pension reform, continues to grow faster than the actual growth of state revenues, and maybe even at a local level as well? Thank you.
It's a good question. Well, the debt would be twofold. It would be, number one, bonded debt if they decide to go and borrow pension obligation bonds or regular bonds, and then they try to hide their bond expenditures in covering overhead. Or it's going to be in the form of just basically running up the pension debt on individuals. So those are the two areas of debt that you immediately could see. State of California might also incur debt by putting a bond measure on the ballot statewide, or actually utilizing existing authorities to go into debt. They also could borrow, as they've done right now, from the unemployment for the unemployment insurance fund. So all of this is the easy way out for the politicians. What they don't want to do is look at core spending. And that's where we need to move the discussion, say no tax increase, period, in the middle of an economic crisis. And if you're talking about debt, borrowing, you need to first show that you have cut every single bit of fat out of the budget before we even talk about any sort of transition financing. Clearly the biggest form of debt is going to be pension, and that needs to be dealt with first in terms of the allocation.
Carl?
Yeah.
Thank
Carl, can I add to that?
Sure.
One of the things that Orange County did after its Chapter 9 bankruptcy was establish a 10-year strategic financial plan. What is our budget going to be for the next 10 years, and how do we allocate the funds to reduce the debt? In the state of California, those tools don't exist. I sat down with the finance director for the University of California and asked her for a 10-year strategic financial plan. And she said, we can't do it. And I said, why? Well, because we would maybe encourage the unions on what maybe they're going to get as pay raises down. So we have decided not to do a financial plan for 10 years. Sorry, Senator, too bad. So we've got to figure out how to teach basic math and accounting to all of our departments, all of our cities, because the County of Orange could determine when could they really take on a new project or new debt, looking at a 10-year plan. And if there was no room, you didn't do it. But if there was room, you could look forward to it in 7 or 8 years.
By the way, that proposal I mentioned at the beginning that came out this morning, the Democrats in Sacramento are saying, gee, we're not getting as much tax revenue. Why don't we do this? Let's give people a bargain. If you prepay the next 10 years of taxes, and it could be income tax or business tax, if you prepay the next 10 years of taxes, give us the money now, we will say you don't have to pay those taxes coming forward. In fact, we're going to give you a 25% reduction on 10 years of taxes. If you actually trust these people, these thieves, with rare exception being John Morlock, if you trust them with that deal, you're a fool. You're an absolute fool. They will not only take your money today, they're borrowing against future tax revenues by you giving them money in exchange for a promise that they won't tax you as much in the future. No, they're going to take your money and they're going to raise your taxes in the future, and you're going to be screwed. So one form of borrowing is what they propose today. And it's so funny. The LA Times has a reporter, Liam Dillon. He's just so far to the left. It's astounding. He said, oh, what an innovative proposal. No, this is borrowing tax revenue into the future, trying to scam people out of that money and promise that you won't have to worry about collecting it 5-10 years in the future. That's another form of borrowing. You also may find accounting gimmicks during this period. If you see something called cash accounting versus accrual accounting, be very careful about accounting changes. Accrual accounting was once used in the city of San Diego to basically reach into the next fiscal year and pull back 2 months worth of revenue because they went from a cash accounting system to an accrual accounting system. These are all games. The reality is they're spending too much and the revenues that they're receiving are not able to sustain it. That's what we need to get back to. What are you getting revenue-wise right now with sober expectations under COVID-19? How do we reduce our expenditures to accommodate that lower revenue cycle? Our next question is from Joe. Joe, go ahead. What's Joe's last name?
Carl?
Joe
Carl.
Maduro.
Yes. Hi, Carl.
Go ahead, ask your question.
Carl, we saw this in 2006 and 2007, and so the Fed passed the TARPs. Now we hit the COVID thing, so they passed the CARES Act. They're printing money, Carl. Can they be stopped?
Well, this is a good question about the federal government printing money. And so, Joe, fortunately, the state of California can't print money yet. And so what they are doing is they're asking for another federal bailout. The number they threw out yesterday was $1 trillion. And that's on top of all the other federal funds that have now been made available under CARES and other legislation. And we're talking trillions of dollars that has been made available to state and local government already, as well as public health systems, the unemployment insurance systems, et cetera. They want even more money. The reality is we've got to say no to the bailout because it would allow the state of California and other states, local government, to basically not deal with the fundamental excesses of their spending. Why should we support a federal bailout when illegal immigrants are being given $1,000?
Carl?
Yeah.
Carl, you're an honest guy. John's an honest guy. Brian's an honest guy. We send people to Congress and we tell them stop doing this, and then they do it. So, Carl, they got the power.
They have the power by virtue of the fact that we elect them. And so we have an election in November. I believe that we need to make this a campaign issue in November for every office in California. Yes. And Brian was with me when we faced a similar problem in 2010, the Great Recession. The Republican mayor and the Democrat city council decided to raise taxes in San Diego, and they raised $1 million to fund a campaign which I believe either John or Will mentioned featured firefighters and police officers. Those were the window dressing tax hike. And then we basically ran a grassroots campaign. The grassroots campaign that we ran basically defeated them 2-1. Even in Democrat seats, and we picked up 2 city council seats as a result of that tax increase and laid the groundwork for pension reform. So I do believe in the ultimate wisdom of the voter, and we need to be ready as activists, and that's why Reform California has the campaign infrastructure that we've been building. We believe that when presented the facts, many voters do open their eyes and say, yeah, it's not right to raise taxes on people who are already out of work. It's not right to continue to borrow when we have excess and wasteful spending. So it's up to us to make that fight. That's the only option we have. And yes, it's not a fair fight, but every once in a while we do win. And when we did defeat the tax increase in San Diego, it was November of 2010. The very next day, we released something called the Roadmap to Recovery, which was a 500-page budget. And the Democrat City Council had to adopt that budget. And it contained no tax increases. It was all about fiscal reform. And they were forced to do that because we took away their tax increase. So it can happen. We just have to be there to fight the battles. And we're not going to win every battle, but we have to fight the battles. We have one more question. What's that? Galaxy. Galaxy, your question's next. Go ahead. Galaxy, like stars in the galaxy? Galaxy, your question's next. All right, it's not coming up. We have Armin Kurdian. Armin? All right, and then so Christopher Drake asks, will groups join together in an anti-tax effort? Which groups? How do you create a sense of fear in the legislators that will induce them to back off of taxes? I don't think that they're going to back off on taxes, okay? They're going to make a run at tax increases because what do they have to lose? They put a tax on, and what they'll say is, well, let the voters decide. And in Sacramento, obviously, if they can get 2/3 vote in both chambers, they can raise taxes. But it's up to us at the grassroots level to fight those battles in any tax that appears on the ballot, as well as go after any legislator in Sacramento that votes 2/3 to increase a tax. Josh Newman's a perfect example of someone who lost their seat because they were the deciding vote on that tax increase. Again, we can't take out all the legislators, but we can focus on a few of them and make an example out of them. So that's the campaign that we are putting together and advancing. And that's a grassroots campaign. We're not going to get support from big groups and lobbyists. They're too afraid of standing up to the governor. We will get support from community members if all of us work together. So we'll work with local groups. We'll work with statewide groups. The Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is the gold standard group when it comes to many of these issues. So we are all talking, all working together. But what we need are grassroots activists like you. And that's so critically important. So with that, we will conclude our town hall on time. Please share the online petition at stoppropertytaxhikes.com. Sign up to become a volunteer at reformcalifornia.org or contribute. And I want to thank our panelists, Senator John Morlock, fighting the good fight in Sacramento, also up for re-election in his Orange County district. It's critical that we all support him. Brian Pepin of the San Diego County Lincoln Club, and Will Swaim of California Policy Center. With that, if you have any additional questions, please email them in to info@reformcalifornia.org, info@reformcalifornia.org, and I thank you all for participating.